On a spring afternoon in 2025, two prime ministers stood side by side in Rome. One of them, Giorgia Meloni, leads the most right-wing government Italy has seen since the Second World War. The other, Mette Frederiksen of Denmark, leads a party of the left, the Social Democrats. On almost everything, these two disagree. But that day, they signed the same letter, and that letter took direct aim at a court that has shaped European law for 75 years. Within months, the number of governments backing them grew from 9 to more than 24. Family reunification suspended in Germany. Asylum approvals at their lowest in decades in Denmark. Return hubs built in Albania beyond the borders of the European Union. Something has shifted across the continent, and it is not coming from the fringe anymore. It is coming from the center, from the governments that built the old system in the first place. 11 nations and counting are now pulling in the same direction. By the end of this, you will understand exactly what changed and why. Before we get into it, if you want more breakdowns like this one, subscribe. We cover the forces reshaping Europe every single week, and this is a story that is still moving as we speak. Now let's get into it. To understand how big this shift really is, you have to go back and see what Europe used to believe. In 1950, the countries of Western Europe signed the European Convention on Human Rights. It was written in the shadow of the war by people who had watched their continent tear itself apart. The idea was simple and noble. Never again would the state be allowed to trample the individual. Everyone, citizen or foreigner, would have a floor of rights beneath them that no government could take away. Out of that convention came the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg, a court whose rulings all 46 member states agreed to follow. For decades, this was the moral spine of Europe. It was the thing that separated the free West from the regimes to the East. And on migration, the consensus held. Europe saw itself as a place of refuge. When people fled war or persecution, the door was supposed to be open. Then came 2015. That year, more than 1 million people crossed into Europe. Many were fleeing the war in Syria. Others came from Afghanistan, from Iraq, from across North Africa, and the Horn of Africa. The images were everywhere. Overcrowded boats in the Mediterranean, long columns of people walking north along railway tracks. And in Germany, Chancellor Angela Merkel said 3 words that would define the era. Wir schaffen das. We can do it. Sweden threw its doors open too. For a country of fewer than 10 million people, it took in asylum seekers at one of the highest rates in the developed world. The Swedish self-image was built on this, a humanitarian superpower, a moral example for everyone else to follow. But the numbers kept climbing, and the mood began to change. Not overnight, slowly, then all at once. The political aftershock rolled across the continent for years. In one country after another, parties that had spent decades on the margins, campaigning almost entirely on immigration, began to surge. Some of them entered government. Others never won power directly, but pulled the whole conversation toward them, until the mainstream parties adopted their language to survive. By the elections of 2024 and 2025, immigration was no longer one issue among many. In much of Europe, it had become the issue, the one that decided who governed, and the established parties learned a hard lesson. You could keep losing voters to the hard line, or you could adopt a version of it yourself. Most of them chose to adopt it. That single calculation, repeated in capital after capital, is the engine underneath everything else in this story. Here is the honest part that both sides of this debate often skip. The policies now sweeping Europe are not written as laws against any one religion. On paper, they are about asylum numbers, about irregular migration, about deporting foreign nationals who commit crimes, and about how fast a claim can be processed. But a large share of the people arriving since 2015 came from Muslim-majority countries. And so, in the public argument, in the newspapers and the election campaigns and the comment sections, the debate got framed in cultural and religious terms. That framing is why you are watching a video with this title. What the governments are actually doing is narrower and in some ways more radical than the framing suggests. Keep both of those things in your head as we go, because the gap between them is where the whole story lives. Let's start with the country that got there first, Denmark. For years, Denmark was quietly building the strictest immigration regime in Western Europe, and almost nobody outside Scandinavia noticed. What made it remarkable is who was doing it. not the far right, the Social Democrats, the party of the welfare state, the party of the left. Their argument went like this: a generous welfare state and mass, rapid immigration cannot easily coexist. If you want to keep universal health care, strong pensions, and high trust between citizens, you have to control who comes in and how many. Prime Minister Fredriksson made it official policy to aim, in her words, for as few asylum seekers as possible. Some of her ministers spoke openly about a target of 0, and the tools were sharp. Denmark shifted refugees onto temporary protection rather than permanent status, so that when a home country was deemed safe again, people could be sent back. It made family reunification harder. It cut benefits for some new arrivals. It even passed a law allowing authorities to seize valuables from asylum seekers to offset the cost of their stay. The results are stark. By the end of November in 2025, Denmark had granted just 839 asylum requests for the entire year. To put that in context, in 1980, immigrants were about 2.5% of Denmark's population. By 2025, that figure had risen to roughly 13%. The Danish government looked at that curve and decided to bend it hard. For a long time, the rest of Europe treated Denmark as an outlier, a small country doing something strange. Now Denmark is being treated as a blueprint. Nowhere is that clearer than right across the water in Sweden. Sweden and Denmark are joined by a bridge over the Øresund Strait. Copenhagen and Malmö are only a few miles apart, but for a decade on this issue, they lived in different worlds. Sweden was the open door. Denmark was the closed one. That is now flipped. The turning point came in 2022 when a center-right coalition took power, propped up by the Sweden Democrats, a party with roots in the anti-immigration movement that had spent years on the outside. Once in government, the new coalition set about copying the Danish model almost point for point. Temporary permits instead of permanent ones. Tougher rules on citizenship. Tighter family reunification. Cash incentives for people to voluntarily return to their home countries. And the numbers moved fast. In 2025, asylum applications to Sweden fell by about 30% in a single year. Since the government took office in 2022, applications have dropped by around 60%, while returns to countries of origin have risen by about the same amount. Swedish ministers now boast about these figures the way they once boasted about how many people the country welcomed. The number of people granted asylum recently hit its lowest level in 40 years. The country that built its identity on being a humanitarian superpower is now dismantling that identity, piece by piece, in public. Then there is the largest player of all, Germany. Germany was the beating heart of the 2015 welcome. It took in more asylum seekers than any other European country, year after year. So when Germany turns, the whole continent feels it. And Germany has turned. Its Interior Minister, Alexander Dobrindt, laid out the new line bluntly. Tighter border controls. People turned away at the frontier. Family reunification suspended. A harder push on deportations. Germany reintroduced checks on its own internal borders inside the passport-free zone, something that would have been almost unthinkable a few years earlier. In 2024, it carried out more than 18,000 deportations, and it moved to speed up removals further. The effect showed up quickly in the data. By the spring of 2025, asylum applications in Germany had fallen by nearly half compared with the year before. The country that said, "We can do it," is now, very deliberately, doing something else. Which brings us back to that letter in Rome and to Italy. Giorgia Meloni came to power in 2022, promising to crack down on migration across the Mediterranean, and she has pushed further than almost anyone. Her signature project is offshoring. Italy struck a deal with Albania to build centers on Albanian soil outside the European Union, where the asylum claims of certain migrants could be processed. The plan has been tangled in legal challenges, including from Europe's own top court, but the Italian government has vowed to push on, expecting the centers to be running by the middle of 2026. The logic is the same one you hear from The Hague to Helsinki. If people believe they can reach European soil and stay for years while their case winds through the courts, they will keep coming, and the smugglers will keep profiting. Move the process offshore, the argument goes, and you break the incentive. So on the 22nd of May 2025, Maloney and Frederickson, the right and the left, stood together in Rome and published their open letter. And they aimed it squarely at the European Court of Human Rights. Their complaint was specific. They argued that the court, over the years, had interpreted the 1950 convention more and more broadly to the point where it was blocking governments from deporting foreign nationals who had committed serious crimes. In their words, the interpretation had, in some cases, ended up protecting the wrong people. They wanted more room to decide nationally when someone convicted of violent or drug-related crime could be expelled. They wanted more power to track migrants who could not be deported. And they wanted tools to counter what they called the instrumentalization of migrants, the tactic where a hostile state pushes people toward Europe's borders to create a crisis. The letter was signed by the leaders of 9 countries, Italy and Denmark, who led it. Then Austria, Belgium, the Czech Republic, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Poland. Add Germany and Sweden, both moving hard in the same direction with their own national measures, and you have 11 nations, from the Baltic coast to the Mediterranean, all pushing against the same wall. Look at that list for a second, because the geography tells you something. These are not all border states drowning in arrivals. Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania sit on the eastern edge, where the fear is less about boats and more about Russia and Belarus deliberately funneling people toward their frontiers as a form of pressure. Since the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the Baltic states have partially closed border crossings, built new barriers, and tightened entry rules, treating migration flows as a national security threat rather than a humanitarian question. Estonia installed gates and roadblocks at crossings with Russia so that authorities could seal them within seconds. Latvia imposed restrictions at its eastern checkpoints and extended limits on Russian and Belarusian citizens. For these countries, a migrant pushed toward the fence by a hostile neighbor is not just a person seeking safety. Under this reading, that person is a chess piece in someone else's game, and the border becomes a front line. Poland and the Czech Republic have long resisted taking in asylum seekers under EU quotas. Belgium and Austria sit in the wealthy core. What unites them is not a single crisis. It is a shared conclusion that the old rules no longer fit the world they are living in. And the response from Strasbourg and from human rights groups was sharp. The Council of Europe warned the 9 leaders not to politicize the court. Legal scholars pushed back hard, arguing that the court has always balanced state security against individual rights, and that tearing up a 75-year-old framework to make deportations easier sets a dangerous precedent. If governments can rewrite the meaning of human rights whenever those rights become inconvenient, critics asked, then what exactly is a right worth? But the momentum did not stop. It grew. By the 10th of December 2025, Maloney and Frederickson had gone back to work, and this time they rallied far more support. A joint declaration was signed by more than 24 governments, calling for the convention's framework to be adapted to the migration and security challenges of the modern world. The declaration asked the court to put more weight on the seriousness of a crime and less weight on a foreign offender's family and cultural ties to the country they live in. The issue is now formally on the agenda of the Council of Europe, with a political declaration by all 46 member states expected in the middle of 2026. In other words, what started as a letter from 9 has become a continent-wide project, and it is happening in national capitals at the same time. Austria has tightened asylum rules and pushed for faster deportations. Belgium signed the letter and backed the harder line. The Netherlands built a system of participation contracts requiring newcomers to take civic education and learn the language within their first year, and its politics have swung sharply toward restriction. Poland has partially suspended the right to claim asylum at its border with Belarus, citing that same instrumentalization threat. Even the United Kingdom, now outside the European Union, unveiled a plan in November of 2025 explicitly modeled on Denmark, shifting refugees to temporary protection rather than permanent status. The British Home Secretary called it the most significant change to the country's asylum system in modern times. The whole continent, quietly and then loudly, is converging on the same model. Now let's talk about the part that a channel like this one cares about, the economics and the strain on the state. The core argument from the restrictionist side is a fiscal one. Modern European welfare states are extraordinarily generous, free or nearly free healthcare, strong unemployment support, public pensions. These systems were built for populations with high employment and high trust. The claim is that when large numbers of people arrive quickly and when a significant share struggle to enter the workforce because of language barriers, missing qualifications, or trauma, the cost lands on the state and on the taxpayers who fund it. In Denmark, that fiscal argument, not cultural panic, is what the Social Democrats put front and center. Protect the welfare state, they say, by controlling who has a claim on it. The way this argument gets made is worth hearing in full, because it is more serious than a slogan. A welfare state is essentially a promise between generations and between neighbors. You pay in during your working years, and the system carries you when you are young, sick, or old. That promise only holds if the great majority of people are paying in, and if there is enough social trust that citizens accept high taxes without feeling cheated. The restrictionist case is that rapid, large-scale arrival strains both halves of that bargain at once. It raises short-term costs for housing, benefits, and services, and it can erode the sense of shared identity that made high taxes politically acceptable in the first place. Whether that case is right is fiercely disputed, but it is not, on its face, an irrational one. And it is why even left-wing governments that built these welfare states are now the ones guarding the gate most jealously. There is also the security argument and the integration argument. In parts of Sweden, cities like Malmö became a flashpoint in the national conversation about gang violence and segregation, about neighborhoods where integration visibly failed and parallel communities formed. Supporters of the crackdown point to this and say the old model promised integration but did not deliver it, and that pretending otherwise only fuels resentment and mistrust. They argue that a country does no favors to anyone, newcomer or native, by letting in more people than it can realistically absorb and then acting surprised when the seams tear. But here is where honesty matters, because the other side of this ledger is real too. Start with the raw numbers, because they cut against the panic. Across the European Union in 2025, asylum applications actually fell by about 19%, following an 11% drop the year before. Around 822,000 people applied, well below the peak years. Irregular crossings were down sharply as well, so the great tightening is happening at a moment when the pressure by the numbers is easing, not spiking. Part of that is the fall of the Assad regime in Syria in late 2024, after which most European countries paused Syrian claims and applications from Syrians collapsed by more than 70%. The crisis that started this whole story is, in many ways, receding. Then there is the economic counterargument. Europe is aging fast. Birth rates are low. Pension systems depend on having enough working-age people paying in to support a growing number of retirees. Many economists argue that immigration, managed well, is not a drain but a lifeline, filling shortages in elder care, construction, healthcare, and agriculture that native-born workers are not filling. Spain has leaned into exactly this view. While its neighbors slammed the door, Spain stayed relatively open, framing migration as an economic asset and even planning to relocate arrivals to where workers are needed. 2 countries, 2 bets, and it will take years to see which one pays off. The demographic math behind Spain's bet is hard to argue with, even for skeptics. Across the European Union, the population is graying and shrinking. In more and more countries, deaths now outnumber births, and the working age share of the population is falling year after year. Someone has to staff the hospitals, care for the elderly, pick the crops, and drive the trucks, and there simply are not enough young native-born workers coming through to do it all. That is the quiet contradiction sitting underneath the crackdown. The same governments tightening asylum rules are, in many cases, also expanding legal work visas and racing to recruit skilled labor from abroad because their economies cannot function without it. So the real fight is not always about whether immigration happens. It is about who gets to come through which door and on whose terms. And there is the humanitarian cost, which does not show up in a spreadsheet. The Mediterranean remains one of the deadliest migration routes on Earth. Thousands of people drown there every year. Critics of the new approach call the whole project Fortress Europe, and they argue that offshoring, return hubs, and pushbacks do not end desperation. They just move it out of sight and raise the body count on the way. So which is it? A responsible correction or a moral retreat? That depends heavily on where you stand And this video is not going to hand you a verdict, because the honest answer is that the continent itself has not settled it. What we can say is what is actually happening, and it is historic. For 75 years, the direction of travel in Europe was toward more openness, more rights, more supranational protection standing above the nation-state. That direction has now reversed. And the reversal is not being driven by a rogue government on the edge. It is being driven by the mainstream left and right together, from Rome to Copenhagen to Berlin. There is one more thread worth pulling, because it is easy to miss and it matters. Notice how careful the governments are with their language. They do not, in their official letters, talk about religion. They talk about irregular migration, about foreign criminals, about the sustainability of the welfare state, about hostile states weaponizing migration. That is partly strategy, because a policy framed around crime and cost survives a court challenge in a way that a policy framed around faith never could. But it also means the reality on the ground is more complicated than the loudest voices on either side admit. The migrants involved are not a single bloc. They are Syrians and Afghans and North Africans, but also, under separate protection rules, millions of Ukrainians. They are people who integrated seamlessly and people who never did. Flattening all of that into one word erases the very differences that decide whether integration works or fails. The next milestone is already on the calendar. In the middle of 2026, the European Union's new pact on migration and asylum takes full effect. It creates a single unified system across all 27 member states, with faster procedures at the border and stricter return rules. The old Dublin system, which decided which country was responsible for an asylum claim, gets replaced. Alongside it, in December of 2025, the EU agreed its first ever bloc-wide list of so-called safe countries of origin, which lets member states fast-track and reject claims from those places much more quickly. The initial list named Bangladesh, Colombia, Egypt, India, Kosovo, Morocco, and Tunisia. If you are from one of those countries, your asylum claim now starts from a position of deep skepticism, and it can be processed and refused at speed. Human rights organizations objected immediately, warning that labeling an entire nation safe ignores the individual, the person who really is at risk, even when their country, on average, is not. And that same summer, the 46 nations of the Council of Europe are due to confront head-on the question those 9 leaders raised in Rome. How much room should governments have to deport, and how much should the courts hold them back? So this is not the end of the story. It is closer to the middle. The consensus that governed Europe for 3 generations has cracked, and 11 nations pushing became more than 24 in the span of a single year. Where it settles, nobody yet knows. But the direction, for now, is unmistakable. Step back far enough, and the pattern is almost dizzying. A treaty written in 1950 to protect the individual from the state is now being challenged by the states themselves. A humanitarian model that defined Europe's self-image for decades is being unwound by the very parties that built it. And a debate the public frames in terms of religion is being fought in the halls of power over courts, contracts, quotas, and welfare budgets. The gap between how this feels and what is actually being decided has rarely been wider. That gap is exactly where the next few years will be won or lost. If you found this useful and you want to understand the next chapter as it happens, subscribe and stick around. The video on screen breaks down how the EU's new migration pact will actually work when it goes live, and why some of the countries that demanded it are already fighting over the details. Watch that one next.